Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. On Sunday, 15th of August, the Taliban entered the capital city of Afghanistan and effectively took control of the entire country. Let's look at what has happened in the last few days, how the US withdrawal has been criticised, and what the future of the country looks like. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page? I've just started uploading a lot more content there, so go check it out. And you definitely should look at my blog, thinkinginenglishpod, for all transcripts and some bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglishpod. To fall. To fall. If a place falls in a war, an enemy army gets control of it. For example, Rome fell to the Vandals in the year 455. Bloodshed. Bloodshed. Bloodshed is killing and violence. As in, we must find a way to end the bloodshed. Exodus. Exodus. An exodus is the movement of a lot of people from a place. For instance, there has been an exodus of workers from the villages to the towns. Sensitive. Sensitive. If something is described as sensitive, it needs to be treated with care and secrecy. For instance, a government minister left hundreds of sensitive documents on the train. Abject. Abject. This adjective means extremely unhappy, extremely poor, extremely unsuccessful, etc. As in, the government's decision has been an abject failure. To evacuate. To evacuate. To move people from a dangerous place to somewhere safe. For example, 1,000 people were evacuated from their homes following the floods. To impose. To impose. To officially force a rule, a tax, a law, or a punishment. For instance, very high taxes have been imposed on cigarettes. Humanitarian. Humanitarian. Involved in or connected with improving people's lives and reducing suffering. The UN is sending humanitarian aid to the worst affected areas. Last week, I made an episode on the situation in Afghanistan. I talked about how the Taliban, an Islamist group that has spent 20 years fighting the US and its allies, was quickly taking over minor cities in the country. And I ended that episode with some questions or guesses about what was going to happen over the next few weeks and months. Feel free to go back and check out that episode. However, a lot has changed in only a few days. Afghanistan has now completely fallen to the Taliban. Since Joe Biden announced the withdrawal of US troops 3 months ago, the Taliban took over provinces and towns across the country. When I wrote last week's episode, half of the country was no longer controlled by the Afghanistan government. Taliban fighters used propaganda, misinformation, and intimidation to ensure control of their expanding territory. Major cities like Kunduz, Kandahar, and Herat fell into Taliban hands through a process of negotiation. The city officials and local governments surrendered control in return for safety and the ability to leave freely. This meant there was not much fighting in many of the cities that fell to the Taliban. As they took over more important cities and more important trade routes, it became increasingly likely that they would eventually take over the capital city, Kabul. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, or I should say former Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, fled the country on Sunday. According to him, it was to avoid bloodshed and violence once the Taliban arrived in the capital city and entered the presidential palace. An exodus of foreign diplomats and residents began once it was certain the country had fallen to the militants. Germany and the UK sent military troops to evacuate European and British representatives. The US took control of Kabul airport, running helicopter trips from the US embassy to the airport and flights out of the country. The scenes at the airport were absolute chaos. Desperate Afghans tried to climb onto military planes and get seats on the final flights out of the country. Embassies across Afghanistan rushed to destroy sensitive documents and anything that could be used by the new leaders of the country. The United Arab Emirates opened the country's airports to allow those fleeing Afghanistan to travel through the Middle East. For the USA and its allies, recent events can only be described as abject and total failure. It is embarrassing and it is shameful. After 20 years of fighting, hundreds of thousands of people being killed, injured, and displaced, nothing has really changed. Their mission didn't do anything. It has been compared to the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. But that comparison is not completely fair. It took 2 years for the South Vietnamese government to collapse after the US left that country. The US has not even completely left Afghanistan yet, and the government has already collapsed. As the US evacuated their representatives and personnel, questions still remain around the Afghan citizens who helped the US military. Thousands of people worked as translators, interpreters, assistants, and on military bases. Many of these people are entitled to residency in the US, but the application process has been slow and difficult. So far, only about 2,000 Afghan families have been evacuated to the US, out of over 100,000 eligible families. Now, the people who have not managed to leave are stuck. If they are found with documents showing they worked for the US, they may be punished or tortured by the Taliban. But if they destroy these documents to stay safe, they will never be able to resettle in America. What will the new Afghanistan look like? The image of Taliban fighters wearing military equipment, long beards and capes, carrying guns, sitting in the presidential office is a clear sign things are going to change. As soon as the Taliban took over on Sunday, they announced their plan to change the country's name to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Initially, there was some hope that a new temporary government would be formed to gradually hand over power to the Taliban. But once the fighters entered the capital city, it was clear that the Taliban were now completely in charge. The last time the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan, they imposed a strict form of Islamic law, banning things like music, stopping girls' education, and using incredibly brutal punishments. Although they have claimed that they are different now, there are already reports that the fighters have stopped women from working and have forced unmarried women to marry fighters. Taliban leaders who led negotiations with the USA in the Middle East and other leaders hiding in Pakistan have begun to return to Afghanistan and are expected to take up leadership positions. The Taliban is not currently recognized internationally as the government of Afghanistan. The West is in a difficult situation. They don't want to help a cruel dictatorship, but also they think that maybe giving the country some money or some help might make the Taliban less cruel. However, neighboring Pakistan has already welcomed the Taliban's success. Representatives from Russia and China have also begun meeting with Taliban officials. These two countries want good relationships with their close neighbor, but they are also worried about the potential for increased terrorism in regions close to Afghanistan. One of the major concerns is for the rights of women under Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban in Pakistan on her way to school, expressed concern for the safety of women and girls over the next few months. The Taliban has released numerous statements declaring that women will be guaranteed rights in line with Islamic law and Afghan values. But no one is really sure what they mean by this. According to activist Pashtana Durrani, girls in Herat were not able to go to universities, and girls in Kandahar were asked to go to their home, and their male relatives were asked to fill in their positions at their jobs. Even if the Taliban leadership are serious about changing, that doesn't mean their followers, their supporters, or their soldiers agree. And when they talk about women's rights, it is not clear which rights they are talking about. So here is today's final thought. So much is changing in Afghanistan, and at such a fast pace, that it is likely the information in this podcast will be out of date by the end of August. Although experts can guess what the Taliban will do and what the future of Afghanistan holds, no one really knows. The country is in chaos. I had originally planned to write an update on Afghanistan when the Taliban took over, but I didn't expect that it would only be a few days after my last podcast. So, what is next for Afghanistan? Well, there will be an international crisis. My friends who work for humanitarian charities and diplomatic agencies are already talking about how to deal with the thousands of refugees fleeing into Afghanistan's neighbors. People have been fleeing into Pakistan and also to the Central Asian states on the other side of the country. The US has also been embarrassed. Its reputation is damaged. Russia and China have already talked about how this demonstrates the Western way of spreading democracy is failing. Even members of the UK government, who never criticized the US, have been criticizing President Biden. Will the US allies like Japan, Israel, South Korea, and Taiwan, who rely so much on US support, begin to question how much they can trust the US? Although China and Russia may be happy at US failure, they must also be concerned for their own countries. China borders Afghanistan. China is also persecuting Muslims in its western province of Xinjiang. There is a real possibility that the Taliban could allow activists and militants from China to use Afghanistan as a base for planning attacks. Russia is the major security power in Central Asia, and they will naturally be concerned about how instability in Afghanistan could move to other places in the region. Russia also has a long and complicated history with Afghanistan, going back to the Soviet Union's attempt to control the region. What do you think will happen to Afghanistan in the future? Are you worried about the future of the country? Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review or rating, recommend it to your friends, or let me know on Instagram. My Instagram is thinkinginenglishpod. The link should be in the description. And make sure you check out the Thinking in English blog. I love hearing from listeners, and I really appreciate all of the messages I have received over the past few months. Feel free to send me a message or give me some advice or recommend a topic. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.